People thought he had lost his mind. A struggling single father, barely surviving in the chaotic heart of Lagos, marries a woman most wouldn't give a second glance, a physically disabled beggar who lived at the roadside. But what happened after the wedding silenced even his harshest critics. Tunde lived on the fringes of Lagos, not in the slums, but not in comfort either. His life was a slow grind of early mornings, overcrowded buses, and long hours in a dusty mechanic workshop in Mushin. He was a man burdened by quiet responsibilities and unspoken pain. Widowed at 32, he was left to raise his 5-year-old son, Korede, alone. His wife, Ifeoma, had passed suddenly from complications during childbirth, and since then, life had never been the same. Everything Tunde owned could fit into a single room: a mattress on the floor, a worn-out standing fan, and a wooden table that served as a dining desk, workbench, and prayer altar all at once. His income barely covered rent, food, and Koridi's school fees, but he pushed on. Not because he was strong, but because there was no one else to do it for him. In Lagos, sympathy was a scarce resource. Nobody had time to pity a man who looked like he still had his limbs, voice, and breath. People expected men like Tunde to hustle, bleed, and show up anyway, and he did. Every evening after work, Tunde would walk past a stretch of sidewalk near Ojuelegba Bridge, where the city's forgotten gathered: beggars, the homeless, roadside hawkers. Among them was a woman who caught his attention. She always sat in the same corner, legs curled awkwardly under her body, her wheelchair rusted and uneven. She wore no expression, just quiet dignity in the midst of chaos. Other beggars shouted, begged, or sang for attention. She never did. He saw her every day for nearly 2 months. She never asked him for anything, but he began to leave small offerings: water, bread, or fruit. No one else noticed, but he saw something in her eyes, not desperation, but endurance, a calm, settled type of strength that didn't scream or ask for pity. Her name was Amaka. No one could explain why or how, but one Sunday morning Tunde made a decision that would change everything. He went to a magistrate court and filed for marriage. Not long after, without much ceremony or attention, he brought Amaka home. When word got out, the response was vicious. Colleagues mocked him, neighbors whispered, even his extended family pulled back. They called it madness, weakness, a spiritual attack. But Tunde didn't explain himself. He wasn't trying to make a statement. He simply saw someone who had nothing, yet carried herself like someone who had peace, and he wanted that in his home. Amaka did not bring wealth, but she brought order. She brought discipline. She transformed his room from a scattered bachelor den into a functioning home. She organized his week, tracked Koride's school needs, helped him manage his tiny income with sharp precision, and created peace in the chaos. Within 3 weeks of their marriage, small shifts began to happen. Tunde was offered a subcontracting job to repair a fleet of commercial tricycles for a transport firm. It was unexpected, the biggest job he had ever handled. The money wasn't life-changing, but it gave him breathing room. He repaired the tricycles faster than expected, and the firm called him again. Amaka urged him to open a bank account and register his services properly. She created a handwritten invoice system, set up a savings plan, and began researching online courses for small business owners. It didn't make sense to outsiders how a woman who used a wheelchair and once begged for food could be so organized, so strategic. But she had not always been on the street. What no one knew was that Amaka had once been in her 3rd year at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, studying accounting, when a road accident left her paralyzed from the waist down. After a long hospital stay and the death of her only sibling, her life spiraled. With no support system and no wheelchair, she ended up in Lagos, surviving off the streets. Tunde never asked for all the details. He didn't need to. He could see who she was by the way she lived, deliberate, honest, and calm. Within 6 months of their marriage, his business doubled, then tripled. He began hiring 2 apprentices. People started referring customers to him, praising his reliability and transparency. He was invited to service the vehicles of a large ride-hailing company that operated out of Ikeja. With that deal, his income reached a level he had never imagined. Those who mocked him now watched from a distance. The same neighbors who whispered about his crippled wife now asked if she could help them set up budgets or manage bills. She did it quietly, never asking for anything in return. Still, no one could explain it. How did a man on the brink of burnout go from nothing to stability in under a year? After marrying someone society had written off? The truth was, Amaka was not a miracle. She was simply someone who had been through fire and learned how to survive without bitterness. And when that kind of strength enters a man's life, something always shifts. But what was coming next would shock even them. Life changed in ways Tunde could hardly process. Less than a year after he married Amaka, everything around him began to transform. His business, once limited to patching up Keknapeps and Danfo buses, had expanded into a full vehicle maintenance operation. He now had a workshop in Yaba, a place with proper signage, painted walls, and steady customer flow. He hired 2 permanent apprentices and a bookkeeper, not out of extravagance, but because he could no longer keep up with the demand on his own. Mechanics from other parts of Lagos came to him for advice. The same people who once mocked his broken sandals and faded trousers now greeted him with respect, sometimes even exaggeration. But he didn't let it get to him. Amaka remained the core of his transformation, even though she stayed out of the spotlight. She was still physically limited, yes, but not mentally. From her place in their modest but now expanded 2-bedroom flat, she managed their finances, trained karate in discipline and reading habits, and ran a free budgeting class online for young artisans and market women. What stunned people wasn't just the improvement in Tunde's life, it was the pace. Within 8 months, they went from calculating how to split 2,000 naira for an entire weekend to talking with real estate agents about small plots in Ikorodu. They weren't rich yet, but they had breathing room, dignity, and direction. As word spread, people began to invent stories. Some said Tunde had joined a secret society. Others claimed Amaka was a spiritualist, pretending to be disabled. One even went as far as suggesting that the wheelchair was just a trick, that she stood up at night to perform rituals. None of it was true. But envy rarely depends on facts. It was during this rise that Tunde began to notice subtle changes around him. Longtime friends who used to share drinks with him no longer invited him out. His former landlady, who once shouted at him for being late with rent, now greeted him with a strained smile and called him Sir. The boys from his old neighborhood, the ones who used to laugh when he walked with patched trousers, started asking him for loans and job connections. Tunde remained cautious. He didn't want to lose focus. For him, the biggest win wasn't the income or the new furniture in their home. It was the peace, that sense of stability he had never known as an adult. The ability to sleep without anxiety, to plan ahead, not just react to survival. Amaka had introduced structure into every corner of his life. She helped him develop proper service packages for customers, offered receipts, and even set up a digital payment system. She encouraged him to attend short online business classes through a nonprofit that supported low-income entrepreneurs. He completed 3 and began teaching his apprentices what he learned. By now, Koredi was thriving. His school performance improved, and his teachers noticed he had grown more confident. He often helped Amaka around the house and told people proudly, "My stepmom is a genius." Still, not everyone was pleased. Tunde's uncle, a man who had ignored him for years, suddenly reappeared, pretending to be supportive. He suggested that Tunde leave Amaka, claiming it was time to find a woman who could match his new level. He called her a temporary helper and warned that her disability would limit the family's destiny. Tunde was furious, but he said nothing. Instead, he tightened his boundaries. Amaka wasn't offended. She had dealt with worse. She reminded him that success attracts both blessings and tests, and that both must be managed with humility and wisdom. As the months rolled on, they became a quiet force in their area. Amaka began volunteering with a local NGO that supported people living with physical disabilities. Tunde started mentoring other mechanics and introduced a free Saturday training for jobless boys in the area. They were not rich, but they were no longer surviving. They were thriving with purpose. But then, something happened. An email arrived late one Friday evening. It was from a corporate logistics company based in Lekki. They had heard about Tunde through a client referral. The company operated a fleet of over 150 vehicles and wanted to outsource their routine maintenance to someone reliable. They requested a formal proposal and invited him to visit their headquarters for a presentation. It was the kind of opportunity that could change his family's life permanently. He and Amaka spent the entire weekend working on the proposal. She handled the numbers, created a slide deck, researched pricing strategies, and reviewed sample contracts. They submitted everything by Monday and waited. 1 week passed, then 2, then a third, no reply. Tunde tried to follow up, but got no clear answers. Then came the news. Someone else had been awarded the contract. A man with political connections and flashy branding. No real workshop, no real staff, just big packaging. Tunde was crushed, but Amaka encouraged him to stay focused. She told him not to tie their progress to one door. That night, Tunde stayed awake long after Amaka had fallen asleep. He sat by the window, watching the city lights, thinking. Something was shifting again, not backward, not forward, something different, and he could feel it, like standing in the quiet just before a heavy rain. The disappointment of losing the Lekki contract lingered longer than Tunde expected. For days, he moved with quiet frustration, not angry, just deeply aware of how easily opportunity could be snatched by connections and packaging. He didn't complain out loud, but something in him shifted. The air around him grew heavier. At the workshop, customers still came, work still flowed, and money still trickled in, but his energy changed. He stopped mentoring the apprentices with the same passion. He came home later than usual, and when he was home, he mostly sat in silence, staring at the walls or scrolling aimlessly on his phone. Amaka noticed. She didn't pressure him. She gave him space. But space has its dangers. While the outside world still saw a strong, focused man, Tunde was gradually slipping into mental exhaustion. The pressure to keep winning, the fear of losing everything he had built, and the weight of being a provider, it was building up beneath his calm exterior. Then came the audit. It started with a routine inspection by local authorities. A visit from sanitation officials led to questions about permits. One question led to another. A licensing issue emerged. Before Tunde could sort it out, he received a fine, then another, then a shutdown notice. His workshop was temporarily sealed. The apprentices scattered, customers left, income stopped. It was as if the ground shifted beneath his feet in one sweep. He felt like a man drowning in a pool he once knew how to swim in. Amaka remained calm. She worked behind the scenes, contacting lawyers, reading regulations, and reaching out to small business groups for advice. But the pace of bureaucracy in Lagos was slow, and every delay added another weight to Tunde's chest. For 2 weeks, they lived on savings. For the third week, they began cutting back. No more meat and meals, no internet subscription, no school transport for Kureid. Everything became minimalist. Tunde, for the first time since his rise, felt powerless again. Old fears returned. What if it was all temporary? What if he wasn't meant for success? What if he really had reached his limit? The tipping point came one morning when his bank account showed less than 5,000 naira, and he had to decide between paying Kureide's school lunch fee or restocking food for the house. He chose school. Amaka said nothing, but he saw her skipping breakfast that day. That evening he sat quietly in their room, phone in hand, looking through job boards. Jobs he was overqualified for, jobs he didn't want. But desperation makes even pride look like luxury. He wondered if he should go back to being a staff mechanic somewhere. At least there would be stable pay, predictable income, no risk, no shutdowns. But the thought of walking away from what he had built, the dream that had started from one borrowed toolbox, made him feel like he was giving up a piece of his soul. That night, Amaka brought him a notebook. Inside were pages of ideas, alternative business plans, a temporary mobile repair unit proposal, a way to reach clients directly, and suggestions for crowdfunding repairs to the workshop through small investor partnerships. She had thought it all through. Tunde stared at the book for minutes, overwhelmed not just by the plans, but by the fact that this woman, who couldn't physically walk, had moved faster in her mind than he had in 2 weeks. And for the first time in his adult life, he cried, not because he was weak, but because he had spent so long being the strong one that he didn't know how to lean when it mattered. That night marked a shift. He picked up the notebook and began working. He rewrote the mobile unit idea, drafted flyers, contacted old customers, and posted on social media. The next day, he began house-to-house servicing, starting with just one client in Surulere. By the end of the week, he had booked 7 appointments. The week after, he got 12 more. It wasn't glamorous. It was hard. Hot sun, no workshop tools, no waiting chairs, just roadside jobs and sweat. But it paid, and it proved that he wasn't done, just redirected. Slowly, money began to flow again. Not much, but enough to get by. Amaka continued researching and drafting letters. A small business consultant she contacted through an NGO helped them understand how to register for a government-backed SME fund. They applied for it and waited. 3 weeks later, a call came. Their grant application was approved. The government would provide a 3 million naira low-interest business recovery loan, enough to reopen, rebrand, and even expand. At first, Tunde didn't believe it. He waited for a scam sign, a delay, a reversal. But the money came through. He stood in front of the bank, staring at the confirmation message, feeling something he hadn't felt in months. Solid ground. He went home and placed the phone on the table. Then, without saying a word, he knelt before Amaka and rested his head on her lap. No words were needed. They had walked through fire. Together. The morning Tunde reopened his workshop was unlike any other. There was no grand ceremony, no media coverage, no dramatic ribbon cutting. Just a new metal signboard, clean overalls, neatly arranged tools, and quiet confidence. The same neighbors who had once mocked him for marrying a disabled roadside beggar now nodded respectfully as they passed. Some even stopped by to shake his hand. But Tunde was no longer hungry for applause. What he wanted, and what he had, was stability. The government grant had allowed him to not only reopen the business, but to also register it officially as a limited liability company. With Amaka's guidance, he put systems in place: digital inventory tracking, online bookings, tax planning, and a part-time accountant. The new version of his workshop didn't just look better, it worked smarter. He hired back his former apprentices and recruited 2 more. They now wore branded overalls and attended regular training sessions. What had started as a one-man hustle had matured into a small enterprise, structured, professional, and scalable. Within 6 months, the business was turning consistent profits. Tunde paid off a large part of the loan early. Clients now included ride-hailing services, private car owners, and even a small delivery fleet that signed a recurring service contract. And Amaka, always behind the scenes, was becoming something of a legend. She launched a micro-coaching platform online where she taught low-income families how to manage daily cash flow, create emergency funds, and start side hustles with less than 10,000 naira. What began as WhatsApp voice notes turned into structured content, then digital courses. The income wasn't massive, but it added an entirely new stream to the household. She also began consulting informally for small businesses in their community. Tailors, traders, food vendors, all people like her, who had lived close to the edge for years. She showed them how to organize their lives in ways that didn't depend on miracles. People stopped seeing the wheelchair first. They saw her results, her resilience, her clarity. By the end of the year, the family had moved into a modest 3-bedroom flat in a quieter part of Gabagada. It was simple, functional, and paid for in full. Khalid changed schools, not to something elite, but to a school with better structure and learning support. His confidence grew, and so did his curiosity. He now talked about becoming an engineer, but it wasn't the physical moves that marked the turning point. It was the shift in how Tunde and Amaka viewed their lives. Tunde no longer worked out of fear of poverty. He worked with clarity. He understood his worth, his capacity, and his limits. He took 1 weekend off every month, started seeing a therapist through a low-cost service for men, and began journaling, something he never imagined himself doing. He and Amaka had begun to think about legacy, not just survival. Amaka, despite all she had achieved, still refused to be called a miracle. She rejected pity and praise in equal measure. She often said she wasn't lucky. She was aware of herself, of her pain, of what she could still do. They had also become quiet givers. No large donations, no publicity. Just simple acts, paying school fees for a neighbor's child, funding a wheelchair for a street hawker, providing tools to a young apprentice starting out on his own. The kind of giving that came from experience, not excess. One Sunday evening, Tunde received an invitation. A multinational auto brand was launching a small business initiative in Nigeria and had heard about his workshop through a local SME spotlight program. They invited him to speak at their event as a grassroots success story, a modest honorarium, national exposure, and networking with other entrepreneurs. He attended, nervous, unsure, but his story resonated, not because it was flashy, but because it was real. It wasn't overnight success, it was a journey. The story of a widowed mechanic who married a beggar and built a business from the ground up struck a chord. Afterwards, a representative from the brand approached him privately. They were piloting a new franchise model for certified service centers. Would he be open to discussing a long-term partnership? Tunde didn't answer immediately. He returned home, shared the news with Amaka, and they spent 2 days reviewing the terms. Then, together, they signed a letter of interest. It was the beginning of another chapter, a chapter they hadn't planned for, but were fully prepared to face. Not long after, on the anniversary of their quiet court wedding, Tunde posted a rare update online, a short message that didn't mention wealth, success, or even struggle. It simply read, "I married a woman who had nothing, but she had peace, clarity, and strength, and that gave me everything I needed."